So we've been learning about Yosef and Yehuda because the Torah tells us that there was this huge showdown between Yosef and Yehuda. Yosef at that time is the viceroy of Egypt, and Yehuda at that time is the representative of the other brothers, the 11 brothers. And the drama is that Yehuda had taken the responsibility to protect his brother Binyamin, and Yosef, playing the role of the viceroy of Egypt, had taken the brother captive. So Yehuda has to approach him. Yosef's the one in a position of power. Yehuda has to approach him and try to convince him to release Binyamin. The Zohar tells us that this is related to the principle of smichus geula litfila, which means that you have a responsibility. And when you daven, the brocha of Goal Yisrael, the brocha that speaks about redemption, has to be close to the beginning of the Amidah. And now we're trying to understand how this all works, because Geula, which is the theme of that brocha, the theme of redemption, is associated with the energy called Yesoid, which is a divine energy that Hashem puts into the world. And so therefore it's represented by what we call Ma. Ma is the mystical name of the divine, the name of Hashem that represents the divine energy that flows from above downwards. Whereas the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, that's a time of complete commitment and what we call bittul, dedication to Hashem. That represents the energy called Malchus. Malchus is how godliness is already manifest within the world, and in such a way that the world has to now, so to speak, generate its own energy of connection to Hashem. Okay, so that's called the energy called Ban. So Ma represents the flow from godliness into the world. Ban represents trying to elevate the world and make it somehow a vessel of connection to Hashem. So that's why things don't seem to make sense to us, because in the story of Yosef and Yehuda, the strength lies with the Ma energy represented by Yosef, the one with all the power, and Yehuda has to approach him in order to try and get something from that energy. So the world, so to speak, has to try and lift itself in order to connect to the higher spiritual realm. Whereas when the Zohar talks about the fact that we're supposed to put Geula near to Tefillah, it seems the exact opposite, that the power hub is in the world of Tefillah, which is the world of Malchus, of human dedication to Hashem, and we have to bring the godliness towards that world. So we need to understand the dynamic. One of the things that we said would be relevant to help us to understand it is that even when you speak about human endeavor, it has to first be inspired by divine inspiration. So there'll always be an initial spark that Hashem gives. Then when we have that spark, we can respond and we can try and lift and elevate ourselves towards Hashem. We also spoke about the fact that Yosef's dream of the brothers gathering wheat in the field and then bringing the bundles of wheat to him means that the idea of working with the world, that's what happens when you harvest wheat, you're working with the world and trying to elevate the world, which means you take the stalks of wheat and you bundle them together, is only the first step in the process. But in order to really elevate the world, you need the input of Yosef, representing, so to speak, this higher inspiration from God's energy that helps to, so to speak, complete the process. We're still not really clear on how it all works. But what we have identified, and what is incredibly useful for us, is that there are different dynamics in the Jewish experience. So, for example, you have the dynamic of Torah learning. The dynamic of Torah learning is not of our doing. We don't create the Torah. We take a product that Hashem has presented us, and then we use that product in order to inspire us. That's what Torah is. So that's the element of what's called, that's the element of Torah learning. Davening, prayer, is almost the opposite. Prayer is like a ladder that stands on the ground and reaches up to the heavens. So we're trying to ascend, we're trying to lift ourselves up, and we're trying to connect to Hashem. And so each one of these two dynamics represents either the Yehuda and Yosef or the Malchus and Yesoid concept. Basically, either it represents drawing godliness down into the world or elevating the world towards Hashem. But last week we spoke about the fact that there's a more profound space in which you could see these two different dynamics. And that is the famous debate in the Gemara, which one is the priority, Talmud or Maaseh? Is the most important thing to study Torah, or is the most important thing to act on what you have studied? And it's exactly the same notion over here, because studying Torah is what Hashem gives me, and then I am inspired and lifted by it. Whereas action is, if we could use the expression, what I give Hashem, because action is my work. I do something. I push myself. I've got to contribute. And the Gemara concludes a very interesting conclusion. Gadol Talmud shemevi lidei maaseh. That ultimately the greatest thing is to learn Torah. Why? Because it brings to deed. Now that seems a paradox, right? It seems self-contradictory. If the greatest thing is Torah learning, then surely it's not a means to an end. So how can you tell me the greatest thing is Torah learning because of what it will achieve? Well, then it's not the greatest thing. If Torah is there in order to bring me to deed, does that not now make it sound like deed is the main thing? So how does that all work? And we learned something absolutely fascinating last week. And in order to appreciate that concept, let's go back one step. We've said that the big difference between mitzvahs and Torah learning is in your personal spiritual experience. You see, when you learn Torah, you feel the godliness, you feel the inspiration, you get the information. It does something for you, it talks to you, it touches you. It's quite a personal experience. So we call that Giluyim. Giluyim means that which is divine and can be experienced. It is Galui, it is revealed. So divine things, divine energy that can be experienced is called Gilui. Now it has an advantage and it has a disadvantage. The advantage of Gilui is, wow, I'm feeling this. That's huge. It's talking to me, it's touching me, it's elevating me, it's inspiring me. So in my world, Gilui is a huge thing. It has a disadvantage. The disadvantage is, in order for something of godliness to be experienced by a human being, it has to be downgraded. We can't handle the full experience. It's too intense for us. We tried that once at Mount Sinai, where Hashem spoke, and we just flew, literally, 12 kilometers back, and our neshamas blew out of our bodies. And everybody had to put us back together again. They had these teams of angels that had to come and reassemble the Jewish people and put us back at the foot of the mountain. It's too intense for us. So the upside of Gilui is how much I feel and experience. The downside of Gilui is it's cut to size. So it's a limit. There's some kind of limit. When a person does a mitzvah, you don't have the Gilui. You don't put a mitzvah and start to feel this tingling in your body. Oh, wow, I can feel the seeping of mitzvah energy into my veins. You don't. When you do a mitzvah, you directly connect to Hashem's essence, which is beyond anything you could feel. That's why you don't have a sensation, because the sensation would completely incinerate you. So it's beyond you completely. The upside of a mitzvah is you key into Hashem's essence. The downside is you don't feel it and experience it until Mashiach comes. When Mashiach comes, then we will experience the full exposure of Hashem's essence via the mitzvahs that we have done. Right now, we're just building up those reservoirs, and when Mashiach comes, they turn on the lights and wow, now suddenly we see exactly what's happened. The thing is this, Gadol Talmud Shemevi lidei maaseh. It's not that simple. You don't just simply go through mitzvahs over the course of a lifetime and then when Mashiach comes you automatically key into Hashem's essence, because the nature, the default setting of a human being is awareness of self mixed in with a little bit of ego, which is allergic to godliness. As the Gemara says, that if a person is full of themselves, Hashem says, there's no room for me. You and I cannot be in the same space. So in order to prime us to be candidates to experience the divine revelation of Hashem's essence, which our mitzvahs achieve, in order to prime us for that, we need the Torah. Because Torah weakens the animal soul. Torah weakens the sense of I. Torah mitigates arrogance. As the famous expression goes, the Gemara tells us, Hashem said, I made a Yetzer Hara, and I made Torah as its antidote. So Gadol Talmud, what is great about Torah learning, Shemevi Lidei Maaseh, it creates access for us to benefit from the Maaseh, from the actions that we do, and from the connection to Hashem that those actions create. Without the Torah, we'd be desensitized, we'd be too caught up in ourselves to be able to feel that essence of Hashem that our mitzvahs have achieved. So that's where we're up to. And now we have a question. V'tzorech lehavin. That's the middle paragraph that we're going to look at now. V'tzorech lehavin. Now we have to understand that al pizeh, based on what we have just said, which is that you require Torah in order to break down the thickness of the self, so that you could become open to receive or to connect with Hashem's essence. Dio kanal. So then we have to ask a question, because one of the things that we said is, when Mashiach comes, then we'll see the greatness of Malchus. Then we'll see the greatness of what this world has to offer, which is directly tied into doing mitzvahs, right? Mitzvahs are performed in this world. But right now, in our world as it is now, we live with Giluyim. So what's more impressive to us is where there's revealed godliness. Like, for example, davening. It has to have geula to wake it up. Torah learning is needed in order to make our mitzvahs meaningful. Yosef sits on the power of the throne. In our world today, the Gilui is our reality. In Mashiach's world, we'll have the essence. So he tells it, he kind of summarizes it here in the brackets. The inyan smichas geula litfila. The reason why in today's world it is so important that we put the bracha Goal Yisrael right next to the davening. We said, yes, it's true that right now we rely on spiritual, tangible experiences. That's what right? Everybody wants to be inspired. But the truth is that even in today's world, that essence of Hashem represented by the davening experience, because remember, when you stand to daven the Amidah, you're supposed to completely discard yourself. When you stand there to daven the Amidah, it's supposed to be ka'avda kamei more, like a servant who is ready and dedicated at the beck and calling of the master. So that tells us that even in today's world, we're not yet in the time of Mashiach. We're not yet in a state of touching Hashem's essence, and yet right now, still in today's world, tefillah is the locus of power. Tefillah, which represents human endeavor, is where you have to bring the geula to. So that principle is going to be even more expressed based on what we've just said. In other words, when we look at the comparison between Torah study and performance of deeds, Talmud Gadol, in today's world, Torah study is the primary, because in today's world we need the Torah study to be able to soften the edges of selfishness. Only when Mashiach comes and we can then reveal Hashem's essence, only at that point will we be able to say Maaseh is fundamentally greater, that deed is actually where all the power was. So this seems to be a little bit of a contradiction, because when we speak about the relationship between geula and davening, again, geula represents divine inspiration. Davening represents human endeavor. When you davened this morning, how did you do it? Smichus geula litfila. First, you said Goal Yisrael, and then without pause, you started to daven Amidah. Because that's the world that we live in right now. That where is the energy? In the world of davening, in the world of human endeavor. Even today. Yet when it comes to the comparison between Torah learning and action, what do we say? Today, Torah learning is greater. And only at a future point will action rise to its true prominence. So we need to understand that. Which one is it? Again, it seems to be that we have a bit of a contradiction over here. Right? That's what it would appear. So yesh loimer habir bazeh. So we can suggest the following explanation. Shatam al zeh she'achshav Talmud Gadol hu. Why is it that we say in today's world that Torah learning is the primary focus of Judaism? Lefi she'Talmud mevi lidei ma'aseh. Why is that? Because in today's world, we know that you have to learn in order to be able to do. That's practical. On two levels, it's practical. First of all, if you don't know the information, how could you possibly apply it in action? So that's the one level at which it's practical. And the second level at which it's practical is, because as we said, you need the Torah to weaken the resolve of the nefesh habahamis, of the animal soul. And in order to weaken that resolve, Torah has to take precedence to introduce you so that your mitzvahs can happen properly. Both of those pieces of information indicate to us that what is the most important thing even now? Action. Because the Torah is facilitating action. And that fact is hu mesubov mizeh sheliyasid lavoy yiyeh ma'aseh gadol. So that is it's an outcome from the concept that today we don't have the full experience, right? We don't have the full experience of the greatness of Maaseh, right? But the fact that it will be that way in the time of Mashiach, that already has some influence on our world even now. Okay, let's understand. What does it mean it has some influence even now? What's the reality? Are we living in a reality that Talmud Gadol, or are we living in a reality that Maaseh Gadol? So reality check. The reality check is that if you live in our world today, the pre-Messianic era, then you like to be inspired. True or false? You like to be inspired. Everybody wants to be inspired. Everybody wants to feel. Everybody wants to relate. Everybody wants to have an experience. That's our reality. Therefore, Gam hagadlus de Maaseh, the fact that today, in today's world, doing the mitzvah is the ultimate value, right? Because that's doing what Hashem wants. In brackets, shal yodo dafka hu hamshachas ha'atzmus. Why is doing a mitzvah the ultimate? Because when you do a mitzvah today, that brings God's essence into the world today. Do you see it today? No. Mashiach will come in a few minutes, please God. You'll see it. But right now, at this moment, do you see it? This morning, when you did whichever mitzvah it was, did you see? No. So therefore, what do we appreciate about doing mitzvahs in today's world? Only that which we could feel. So let's say that a person does a mitzvah, and while they're doing the mitzvah, they feel spiritually uplifted, they feel inspired, they feel connected. So you could make the mistake of thinking, now I've got the full value of the mitzvah. In other words, let's say it's Shabbos. So a person has Shabbos. How do you celebrate Shabbos? People will tell you, ask people. So you get different kinds of people, right? For some people, Shabbos is amazing because you get off that hamster wheel. And that's the relief of Shabbos. For another person, Shabbos is beautiful because you get to spend quality time with your family. For another person, Shabbos is beautiful because it just feels so spiritual. You sing those tunes and they talk to your neshama and you learn, and at the meal you bring in holiness into the meal, and the entire experience is a fully spiritual experience, right? So what is my experience of doing a mitzvah in today's world? That which is begaloi, that which can be experienced, that which can be revealed. That's my experience of a mitzvah. To me, that's why the mitzvah is great today. Because I am able to experience it in a personal way today. So my experience of the mitzvah as I perform it today is all about the spiritual inspiration I get. How do I imbue my mitzvah with the value of connecting to Hashem's essence through learning Torah? Because we already said when you learn Torah, that's what diminishes the sense of self and ego, which would be the obstacle to experiencing Hashem's true revelation. So today I need my Torah learning to get me past just simply the so-called feeling of inspiration that I can have. It's for that reason that in my world today, the primary element is Torah. Because Torah is the only part of the Jewish experience that allows me to take my mitzvah beyond just what I experience in the mitzvah. If I didn't learn Torah and I just went about doing mitzvahs, so I'm a nice person. So I do acts of charity and I invite guests, so I'm hospitable and I respect people who are older than me and respect my parents and all these things because I'm a nice person. The whole experience is whittled down to my size. When I learn Torah, on the other hand, learning Torah means that I'm now accessing Hashem's view of this mitzvah. So maybe lidei maisa, the Torah learning that I do now, takes my action to a whole different level of action or the experience of that action. Okay, which means that the next piece is going to be slightly technical. So now we can explain the Mashakasu behadrushim. In various places in Hasidus, they make the following statement. Sham shocha dema le'oirer haloas man deban ukinyan talmud shemevi lidei maise. Not overly technical, but just you've got to kind of hold in your mind the different references that we use over here. We've got three references here. Ma, man, ban. Okay? Sounds like alphabet soup. Ma and ban are two different divine energies that operate in opposite directions. Ma is divine inspiration, when Hashem decides to stimulate us spiritually. Ban is human endeavor, when we decide that we want to lift our world to create a connection to God. That movement of lifting our world to connect to God, that movement is called man, which stands for Mayin Nukvin, the so-called feminine waters, which effectively means the groundswell of human endeavor to try to connect to Hashem. Now, we've already identified that none of us would ever move unless there was some initial inspiration that came from Hashem. So there's a Ma trigger that starts a Ban elevation process. That's exactly the same principle as Torah for the sake of action. Because Torah is Ma, that's Hashem's input. Torah is Hashem's gift to us. Matan Torah, I gave it to you as a gift. Action is our reciprocal behavior. We're now going to do what you've said in that gift, and we're going to act on it. So without Torah, can you know what to do? No. Without Torah, can you do it in the appropriate fashion without being caught up in ego? No. So Talmud, maybe lidei maisa, you need the initial trigger of Torah to get the mitzvah to be the way the mitzvah should be. So therefore, the relationship between Torah and action is similar to the relationship between Ma and Ban. An initial spark that gets the process to move and to work. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is, we're going to bring this back to the concept of Yosef being on the throne and Geula and Tefillah. That's all got to link up, right? So let's say that this concept is Hugam Biur al Zeh Sheha What was our question? Our question was that there seems to be a contradiction, because on the one hand, you're telling me that in today's world, the most important thing is Torah learning because that stimulates action. And on the other hand, you're telling me that even in today's world, I have to bring Geula, which represents divine input, close to Tefillah, which represents human endeavor. So it does seem to contradict, because on the one hand, you're telling me the main thing is Torah, and on the other hand, you're telling me the main thing is action. Now we can explain it. So Hugam Biur, this principle also explains to us, Al Zeh Sheha Desmichas Geula Litfila. When we talk about the fact that the Brocha Goal Yisrael always has to be close to the Amidah, which is proof, Shemoire Al Maila Satfila, that is proof that what is so valuable and so important is davening. That is an indicator to the fact that when Mashiach comes, then we'll see that Yehuda is of a higher spiritual stature than Yosef. In today's world, Yosef is the king. In today's world, Yosef represents the higher experience of spirituality. When Mashiach comes, Yehuda will rise to prominence. Why? What's the connection? Now we're going to say here exactly what we just said about mitzvahs versus Torah. Mitzvahs are greater than Torah. Why? Because mitzvahs link us to Hashem's essence, while Torah reveals the experience of godliness that we can relate to. So fundamentally, mitzvahs are greater than Torah. But in our world today, that's not our experience. In our world today, we require Torah in order to have meaningful Judaism. So only when Mashiach comes will we see the full value of mitzvahs and how they represent Hashem's essence. Same with Yehuda and Yosef. Yehuda's greatness as the ultimate Jewish leader, him and his dynasty, because Mashiach, remember, comes from Yehuda, being the ultimate Jewish leader, that's something we're only going to see and experience fully in the time of Mashiach. Mikol mokoim, but that's not to say that there's no value in Yehuda now. Or to put it differently, that's not to say that there's no value in human endeavor now, or no value in Malchus now. Because remember, they all align. Yosef equals divine input, equals Torah. Yehuda equals human endeavor, equals action. Yosef equals the element called Yesoid, the divine attribute of Hashem's input into our world. And Yehuda represents Malchus, the divine attribute of what we find in the world through our own efforts. When Mashiach comes, that's going to be the golden mean. When Mashiach comes, that's what we're going to celebrate. Human endeavor, what we were able to find within this world to draw closer to Hashem through our efforts. We don't see that yet, but it doesn't mean we don't see it at all. One place where we do see it very clearly is the fact that you have to learn Torah to know how to do mitzvahs properly. That tells you mitzvahs are the goal. Mitzvahs are the ultimate. Torah gets me there. So even in today's world, where I don't yet experience the full experience of what mitzvahs have to offer, I'm aware of the fact that they're the goal. I'm aware of the fact that that's where Torah takes me. I'm aware of the fact that mitzvahs are what Judaism is all about, or as we like to say, ha'maisa hu ha'ikar. The main thing is not how much you know, but how much you apply what you know. So that means that already in today's world, pre-Moshiach, it is possible, not only is it possible, it is what happens. We start to detect symptoms of the greatness of Malchus, the greatness of human endeavor, even in today's world. Even before Moshiach comes. One example is, sorry, I lost the place. One example is, Hamayle ditfile legabe geula. One example is every single morning and evening when we open up our Siddur and we're told halachically that we have to make sure there's no interruption between Go'al Yisrael, a brocha that represents divine input, and the beginning of the Amidah, which represents human input. The fact that there can be no break is so that we are conscious that even today all divine input is in order to stimulate human endeavor. Fascinating thought, right? Why does Hashem inspire us? Why does Hashem give us a Torah? Why does Hashem take off whatever load, because that's what Geula is, take away our problems? Why? To facilitate us doing what Hashem wants. The Rambam puts this very well. The Rambam says that there is no reward for mitzvahs in this world. All the reward for mitzvahs will only be experienced in the next world. Says the Rambam, read in the Torah and it says, if you follow my statutes, I'll give you rain in the right time, and your enemies will be vanquished, and you'll be healthy, and nobody will miscarry, and you'll have financial support. But you just said there's no reward in this world. Says the Rambam, that's not reward. That's pragmatism. If Hashem sees that a person is doing mitzvahs, then Hashem wants to remove impediments to them doing more mitzvahs. So that's not a reward, that's a facilitation. And that tells you that the main thing that Hashem wants is that we should do mitzvahs. The main thing Hashem wants is that we, as Jewish people, should fulfill the precepts of Judaism. And therefore, He'll give us things along the way, whether those things are money in the bank, good health, or spiritual inspiration. They're all there to facilitate us doing what Jews are supposed to do. So even today, before Mashiach, in our world, you can see that the goal and the purpose of everything is to do mitzvahs. With that, we can also explain Gam Ashakosov B'Zohar, why the Zohar told us the Hagoshas Yehuda LeYosef Hu Inyan Smichas Geula Litfila. This is one of the first questions we asked early on in this mimer, because the Zohar appears to be saying something that is completely contradictory. Remember, that's how we actually started this conversation. We said, 1 second. In the story of Yosef and Yehuda, Yosef holds the power, and therefore Yehuda has to approach him and beg him, please allow my brother free. In a spiritual context, Yosef represents Yesod, which is divine inspiration, whereas Yehuda represents Malchus, which is human endeavor. So if I read the story of their interaction at a deeper level, what's the story telling me? All of the power lies in divine inspiration, so human beings have to ask, please Hashem, inspire me. That's what the pasuk is saying. Says the Zohar, that story of the confrontation of Yehuda and Yosef is the same spiritual principle as saying Goal Yisrael right before the Amidah. And we said, how's that even possible? Saying Goal Yisrael straight by the Amidah tells us that the Amidah, which represents human endeavor, is the locus of power. And Hashem has to bring His inspiration to that place to help us. We're the ones who have the power, and Hashem has to come help us. In the story of Yosef and Yehuda, Yosef has the power, and we have to beg, please inspire us. Seems to be contradictory. How could the Zohar tell us that the two are effectively the same spiritual principle? Now, based on what we have explained about the nature of the relationship between Torah learning and deed, and the experience of how we know the greatness of deed in our world and how it will be in the time of Mashiach, which is completely different, that will help us to understand this apparent contradiction in what the Zohar is telling us. How so? Because Av Shahagoshas Yehuda LeYosef Moire Bichlal Alamayle Dezo. At face value, if Yosef represents divine inspiration and Yehuda represents human endeavor, and Yosef is on the throne and Yehuda is begging, so then at face value it's telling you divine inspiration is the most powerful thing and we've got to just grovel to be able to get some. That's how it looks at face value. But when you drill down into the details, you discover Ki yeshna minyonim behagoshas Yehuda leYosef. There are elements to this story of Yehuda approaching and begging Yosef that actually show us the power of Malchus Tidirakamon, as we'll express in detail in the rest of this mimer. Now, before we do that, let's look at the story just simply as a story. Leave out all the spirituality from it. Yosef's strength sitting on that throne is that he's sitting on that throne. It doesn't tell us anything about his inner power. It just tells us about the position that he occupies. And if you're familiar with history, you'll know that many people who occupied that position did not deserve to be there, and they didn't necessarily have power. Yehuda, on the other hand, Yehuda must have a tremendous inner strength because Yehuda stands up to the king. So he may not have the benefit of the position, but he clearly has very deep-seated power as a person. That's interesting, right? That should already start to shift our appreciation of the story. So it's how the story appears, and it's how the story actually plays out. Although that's not the main part that this mimer is going to focus on. The mimer is actually going to focus on a couple of other elements of how Yosef went about finally revealing his identity that seemed to be a little bit strange. So let's look at those anomalies. Paragraph Vav. Yuvan zeh, to understand how within the story of Yosef and Yehuda, you could already detect Yehuda's power, even though the story at face value is all about Yosef holding the keys to their freedom. So the Yuvan zeh will understand that behektem by first examining an anomaly in the story. Mashagoshas Yehuda lo Yosef. Why is it that it's at this moment in the story where Yehuda approaches Yosef, and doesn't just approach him, but he specifically says, "Vamirosoi eich ele el avi goimer." How will I possibly go back to my father empty-handed without my brother? Hevi lozeh shelo yochol Yosef lisapek goimer. Why was that the straw that broke Yosef's back? Why was that the catalyst that Yosef could no longer restrain himself? V'hizvada el Echov, and he confessed to his brothers. He revealed his identity. What did Yehuda say there that was so powerful and so compelling to Yosef? Now, of course, if you read the story at face value, you could say it's a very emotional moment, because at that point, Yehuda has evoked within Yosef this guilt over the trauma he's going to cause to their father. You're going to send us home empty-handed. He's already lost one son in his mind. And you could understand it from a purely psychological perspective, but that's not what we're looking to do over here. We want to understand this spiritually. Because if you think about it objectively, surely, by the time that they came back to Yosef with Binyamin, if there was anything that was going to hit the sweet spot of his emotion, surely it should have been seeing his brother Binyamin. Surely at that point he should have melted and he should have opened up and said, "Okay, I'm Yosef." Surely think about it. The one thing that Yosef must have cared for more than anything else in the world is his brother Binyamin. His only full brother, the brother that represents his mother, the brother that... That's what... surely the whole conversation was to get to this point. And even if you want to be philosophical about it and say, as many of the commentaries do tell us, that effectively what Yosef wanted and needed to do was to help his brothers to do teshuvah. And the only way you can ever do teshuvah for something is to be put into the identical situation and behave differently to how you did the first time. So seeing as they had sold their younger brother, Yosef, and now they had the opportunity to save their younger brother, Binyamin, so it's the opportunity for them to do teshuvah. That all makes sense. Fine. So when Binyamin gets to Egypt, that's it. The story's over. The whole charade is over. Why didn't he? Why does Yosef come up with this strange strategy to hide his magical goblet inside Binyamin's luggage, knowing that what's going to happen when he does that? They're going to have to come back. Why is it significant to Yosef that they should come back? You want to tell me that he wanted to make them do teshuvah, arrest Binyamin on the spot and some other ridiculous charge. But he wanted them to leave and come back. Why did he need them to leave and come back? It's a critical part of the story. And even when they did come back, he still didn't immediately reveal his identity. Only after Yehuda approaches him and puts forward this very powerful argument, how am I going to go to my father? That's when Yosef tells him, okay, listen, I'm Yosef, and you can relax. It's not the end of the world as you know it, and everything is going to be fine. Why? So once we understand that principle, we'll be able to tie up the whole concept of this balance of Malchus and Yesod, of divine inspiration and human endeavor, which is, of course, the main theme of this particular mimer, which, please God, we'll do next week.